This is the second video in our Upper Room series. Remember, in this series, we're looking at the Gospel of John, chapters 13 all the way to 17. In each video, we're looking at the ways that Jesus invites us to live the way he did, through the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, in case you forgot, let me give you a little context on these chapters. These 5 chapters are famously called the Upper Room Discourse because they took place literally in an upstairs room. It's in these words of Jesus that we get some of his most famous teachings. And our hope during this series is that we'll all see how these words of Jesus are inviting us out of our comfort zones and into a new way of life. This section of the New Testament is one of the largest uninterrupted chunks of Jesus' teaching that we can find. Now, this conversation in the upper room, it comes just hours before Jesus is betrayed and arrested by the Jewish leaders and then crucified by the Romans. When we read these chapters, you can feel the energy of Jesus' words. And I want you to imagine as we read yourself sitting at the table in that upstairs bedroom 2,000 years ago. The words from Jesus' mouth, they hang in the air. And you don't know it yet, but this is the last time. The last time your teacher, your mentor, your friend will sit and share his wisdom with you. Now, each week we're going to look at 2 ways that Jesus, during this conversation, invites us to live the way he did. In chapter 13, in the last video, we saw Jesus invite us into his way of life through servant leadership and radical love. I hope you were each encouraged to think about who do you need to serve and who do you need to love. John 14 has some pretty powerful things to say. It has some pretty powerful things to say about what it means to live the way Jesus did. Let's start with verses 6 and 7. Jesus says, "I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." A little later in the chapter, we'll read Jesus saying, "If you love me, you will obey what I command. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you." Sometimes, when I look back on the life of Jesus, I think how easy it would have been for him to take all the credit, for him to take all the glory and honor for himself, but Jesus never does that. He never follows up a miracle or some profound teaching with a line about how great he is. Instead, Jesus is constantly pointing people to God the Father and to the Holy Spirit. He's constantly giving credit where credit is due. Now, I know it can be confusing to think about Jesus giving praise to God the Father or the Holy Spirit, especially when we talk about the doctrine of the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus. But ultimately, the Trinity is a perfect community of humility and love. Jesus can't help but lift up the Father and the Spirit because he knew something important. Jesus knew that his way of life was only possible because he was never alone. Jesus knew that his way of life was only possible because he was never alone. Jesus was in constant contact, constant communication with God the Father, and he was constantly working through the power and leading of the Holy Spirit. And if that's true for Jesus, then it's certainly true for us. If you and I want to live our lives the way Jesus did, then we need to realize and get comfortable with the fact that we're never alone. Jesus tells the disciples that he'll send another counselor, the Holy Spirit, and that they'll know him because he lives in them and will be with them. That same thing is true for you and for me today. If you've chosen to put your trust in Jesus and follow him with your whole life, then the Holy Spirit lives in you and is with you always. You are never alone. If we want to live the way that Jesus did, then we have to realize that he's the way, he's the truth, he's the life, and we have to realize that we can do nothing of significance or value apart from him. And ultimately, we have to realize that we're never alone. Jesus was never alone. He did everything by the direction of the Father and through the power of the Holy Spirit. And the same thing can be true for you, and it can be true for me. Later in verse 23 of chapter 14, we read Jesus saying these words, "If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will come to him. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." Remember, we're trying to learn the ways that Jesus invites us to live the way he did. And this entire chapter is built on two ideas that answer that question. We're never alone, and we need to be obedient. We're never alone, and we need to be obedient. If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Now, it's important to talk about obedience because so many people have a negative view of being obedient. We associate obedience with being forced by our parents to do boring and mundane chores. We associate obedience with teachers telling us to sit down and be quiet. It's easy for us to associate obedience with simply being told what to do and then doing it, no matter how you feel or whether you agree or not. But when we look at Jesus' life, when we look at his attitude, we don't see him frustrated and grumbling as he goes along doing the will of God the Father. In fact, we see just the opposite. Jesus is content and excited about doing the work God has given him to do. So why do we have such a hard time being obedient to our parents, to our teachers, even to God? I think Jesus knew a secret that he wanted to share with each of us. I think that Jesus saw obedience to God as a partnership. You know that phrase, you don't have to do it, you get to do it? Jesus lived that out. He doesn't look at being obedient to God's will as something he has to do or something he's forced to do. Instead, Jesus looks at obedience as an opportunity to partner with God. And I think you and I need to do the same thing. We need to change our understanding of obedience from forced submission to joyful participation. Let me say that again. We need to change our understanding of obedience from forced submission to joyful participation. Jesus is inviting us to participate in his way of life. He's not gonna force us. He's not gonna coerce or trick us. He's inviting us to participate. Here's the reality. God is always working and he's always looking for partners. God is always working and he's always looking for partners. Could God do whatever he wants with the snap of his fingers? Yeah, he probably could. But he doesn't want to. Since the beginning, God's desire has been for us to partner with him in the work he's already doing. So, how is Jesus inviting us to live the way he did through the power of the Holy Spirit? First, by assuring us that we'll never be alone. And second, by reminding us that obedience is all about partnership. And I believe that when we start living with the realization that we're never alone, and that God is constantly looking for ways for us to partner with him, then you and I, we can start to live the way that Jesus did.